Midnight. A 40-story tower, empty, except for the squeak of a cart's wheel rolling down a darkened hall. A calloused hand lifts a red marker toward a board no one was ever supposed to touch. They said he was only there to mop the floors. And yet the lines taking shape on that board, the 17 most expensive minds in the building couldn't crack in 3 days, are solved in 20 minutes. High above one window still burns with light. Someone is watching. And somewhere in another pocket of shadow, a different hand taps softly at a keyboard, quietly burying a single line of code no one can see, timed to detonate in front of the whole world. $40 million on the table. A name about to be dragged through the mud. A lie wrapped as carefully as a gift. The clock reads 9:47. Then the lights go out. The boardroom on the 40th floor of Halden Systems had a way of making people feel small. Not because of its size, because of its silence. 17 engineers sat around a table that cost more than most of their cars, and not one of them dared to breathe too loud. The glass walls looked out over a city, going dark lights flickering on one by one, like the whole world was settling in for the night. But nobody in that room was going home. Not yet. At the head of the table stood a woman in a charcoal suit, her back to them, watching the skyline like it owed her money. Adrienne Marchetti, 51 years old, CEO of Halden Systems. The kind of woman who could freeze a room with a look, and had done exactly that more times than anyone could count. 3 days, she said. Quiet, almost gentle, which was worse than shouting, and everyone in that room knew it. 3 days, 6 emergency meetings, $500,000 in consulting fees. She turned. And what do I have to show for it? Nobody answered. On the massive screen behind her, a tangle of failure charts glowed red. Lines of code bled down the display like something wounded. It was supposed to be their crown jewel. A predictive engine worth more than the whole floor they were sitting on. And it was broken. I asked a simple question, Adrienne went on. Why is the model drifting? And in 3 days, the best minds I pay a fortune to keep have given me apologies. Not answers. Apologies. Her heels clicked once against the tile as she stepped forward. So here is what happens now. You have until morning. I want a solution on my desk by 8. Not another meeting. Not another slide. A solution. She scanned their faces, found nothing, and left. The door sealed behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss, and only then did the room exhale. 17 people all at once, like they'd been holding it in for an hour. Somebody muttered something about coffee. Somebody else just put their head down on the table. None of them noticed the man outside the glass. I was on his knees in the hallway, picking up a soda can that had rolled under the water cooler. Gray uniform, faded at the seams. One earbud in the other, swinging loose against his chest. A mop leaning against his cart like a tired old friend. Elias Vance, 36 years old. Night custodian 3 shifts a week. And nobody in that building knew his real story. Nobody knew about MIT, about the scholarship, about the year he was top of his class in a program that ate geniuses alive and spit most of them out. Nobody knew that once a long time ago this man used to dream in equations. Then life happened, the way it does. A woman he loved. A wedding in a courthouse because they couldn't afford anything else. A daughter with her mother's laugh. And then a hospital room and a hand going cold in his, and a little girl asking a question he still didn't have an answer to. So the equations went quiet, and Elias picked up a mop instead. He wasn't looking at the trash anymore. He was looking through the glass, at the screen, at those bleeding red lines, because something on that board was bothering him. The way a wrong note bothers a musician. The way a crooked picture frame bothers you from across the room. He couldn't have told you why not right away. He just felt it deep in some part of his brain he thought he'd shut off years ago. Wrong. That's wrong. The engineers were filing out now, grabbing jackets, muttering good nights, and Elias waited the way the invisible always wait until the last of them was gone, and the hallway was his again. Then he pushed his cart to the boardroom door, slipped inside. The lights were still on, humming faintly. The whiteboard along the far wall stretched 12 feet, covered in equations, arrows, half-erased corrections from a dozen frustrated hands. It looked like a battlefield. It looked like a war they'd lost. He set his mop against the table, reached for the rag on his cart to wipe it all clean, and stopped. His hand hovered an inch from the board. "Wait," he said. To nobody. "Wait a second." He tilted his head. "Read the whole thing again, top to bottom, the way you'd read a letter. You weren't sure you understood the first time." They were modeling the behavior as linear. Straight lines, predictable slopes. Except the thing they were trying to predict didn't move in straight lines. It curved. It doubled back on itself. It behaved the way people behave, the way weather behaves, the way anything alive and complicated behaves. A rookie mistake dressed up in expensive math. His late wife used to tease him about this, about the way he'd go still in the middle of a conversation, eyes going somewhere far away, chasing a thought, like a cat chasing something under the couch. "There he goes," she'd say. "Lost him again." I was lost now, and it felt for the first time in years like being found. He picked up a red marker from the tray, uncapped it slowly, the smell sharp and chemical and strangely familiar. Then he went to work. I didn't erase the whole thing. He was careful, surgical. He wiped away one segment, drew a curve, in its place a smooth rising S that flattened at both ends. He circled two variables that had been swapped, underlined a single node that had been weighted wrong. Small changes, the kind that don't look like much, the kind that change everything. He stepped back, crossed his arms, studied his own handwriting on that glowing wall, and for one quiet moment he almost smiled. "They've been reading it backwards," he murmured. "And you think you've got it right." The voice came from behind him, soft, steady, wrapped in something cold and patient. Elias turned. She was standing in the doorway. Adrienne Marchetti, hair pulled back, tight eyes, already doing that thing. They did measuring him, weighing him, filing him away. She hadn't gone home either. Of course she hadn't. His mouth went dry. "I wasn't trying to mess with anything, I swear. I was just cleaning, and I saw something, and so." She stepped into the room. "The night janitor is correcting a $100 million algorithm." Not correcting. The words came before he could stop them. Just reframing. It's like switching from a dull knife to a sharp one. Same job. Less pain. She stopped, blinked, just once. Because whatever she'd expected the man with the mop to say, it wasn't that. Adrienne walked to the whiteboard. Didn't look at him now. Looked at the board, at the curve, at the circled variables, and Elias watched her face do absolutely nothing at all, which somehow scared him more than anger would have. She pulled a tablet from inside her jacket, tapped it awake, and without a word, she started entering his changes into the simulation one by one, her nails clicking against the glass. The room was very quiet. Elias shifted his weight. Thought about the mop. Thought about how there was a very good chance he was about to be fired, escorted out by security, told never to come back. Thought about Nora asleep at home with the neighbor keeping half an ear out and the rent that was due on Friday, and the small mountain of everything that could go wrong if he'd just made the biggest mistake of a life already full of them. The simulation ran. He counted the seconds. Not because he wanted to, because his brain did it automatically the way it always had. 1, 2, 3. Adrian's eyes moved across the screen. 4, 5. Something in her jaw shifted just slightly. 6, 7. She went still. The training error, she said, flat, careful, dropped by 60%. She looked up, and for the first time she really looked at him. Not the uniform, not the mop. Him. "Who are you?" "Elias." He cleared his throat. "Elias Vance. I clean nights, 3 shifts a week. Have for about a year now." "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze, and something in him, some old stubborn thing he thought had died a long time ago, decided not to look away. "MIT," he said. "Almost. Left in my junior year. My wife got sick. Then she passed. And I had a daughter who needed someone home more than she needed a dad with a diploma." He shrugged a small, tired motion. "So here I am." Adrienne set the tablet down on the table. Slowly, like it had suddenly gotten heavy. "Do you understand what you just did?" "I didn't step on anybody's toes," he said quickly. "I know how it looks. Guy shows up with a mop, starts scribbling on the CEO's magic wall." "That's not what I asked either." He stopped. "I saw something everyone else missed," he said finally. "That's all. Sometimes the person who's not supposed to be in the room is the only one who can see the whole room." Adrienne studied him for a long moment. The city glowed behind her, 1,000 windows, 1,000 livies, and somewhere in all of it, a woman who ate lunch at her desk and signed more legal documents than birthday cards was doing something she hadn't done in a very long time. She was thinking about a person instead of a number. "That sounds like a fortune cookie," she said. "Maybe." A faint grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Or maybe it's just plumbing. If the tub won't drain, you don't pour in more hot water. You unclog the pipe." And there it was again, that flicker across her face. Not a smile, but the ghost of where a smile might live if she ever let one out. "Conference room C," she said, turning toward the door. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. You'll be on the observer list." What no. I don't need to be in a meeting. I'm just the guy who—" "That wasn't a suggestion, Mr. Vance." She glanced back over her shoulder. "It was an instruction." He opened his mouth, closed it, then thought of the one thing that mattered more than any of this. "What about my daughter? She's 6. Mornings are tight, and I've got nobody who can— There's a family room on this floor. Toys, a television, somebody from the office who'll sit with her." Adrienne said it like she'd already arranged it, because she had. "That part isn't your problem." She paused at the threshold. And for just a second, something in her eyes softened so faint he might have imagined it. "She doesn't need much," Elias said quietly. "Just one reason to believe her dad's worth being proud of." Adrienne didn't answer that. She couldn't somehow, so she just held his gaze one beat longer than she meant to. Then she was gone, heels fading down the hallway like the ticking of a clock. Elias stood alone in the boardroom, the red marker still in his hand, his own strange handwriting glowing on the wall in front of him. He looked at it, then at the mop waiting patiently in the corner where he'd left it. "Well," he said to the empty room, Guess I owe you a Ray's old friend. He didn't sleep much that night. Not because of nerves, though there were plenty of those, but because Nora refused to close her eyes until she'd heard the whole thing. Every word. Twice. She sat up in her little bed blanket, bunched around her waist. A stuffed rabbit, missing one ear, tucked under her arm, and she stared at him with those enormous eyes she'd inherited from her mother. "So she just walked in," Nora said. "And you weren't even scared?" Elias sat on the edge of the mattress and brushed a curl off her forehead. "Sweetheart," he said, "when you've held your mom's hand in a hospital and told your little girl she can't ask for her anymore." He stopped, swallowed. "CEOs don't scare you much after that." Nora went quiet for a moment. Then she leaned in close like she was sharing a state secret. "I think she likes you," she whispered. Elias laughed, and it came out rougher than he expected. "Go to sleep, kid." He tucked the blanket up under her chin, kissed the top of her head, and turned off the lamp. Then he stood in the doorway for a while longer than he needed to, watching her breathe in the dark. Tomorrow, he was going to walk into a room full of people who'd spent their whole lives being told they belonged there. And he was going to sit in the corner in his one clean shirt, the one with the faint coffee stain near the hem that no amount of washing would lift. And he was going to feel every inch of the distance between his world and theirs. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, his daughter was asleep and safe, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, some quiet, stubborn part of him was awake again. The part that used to dream in equations. He didn't know it yet. But somewhere across the city, in an office with the lights still burning, a woman was standing at a window running his simulation again and again, watching those red lines smooth themselves into something like order. No degree, no title, no permission. And still she thought, and didn't finish the sentence. Outside, the first rain of the season began to trace soft silver lines down the glass. By 7:50 the next morning, Elias Vance was standing outside Conference Room C, holding a satchel that had seen better decades and wearing the cleaner of his two dress shirts, the one without the coffee stain. Barely. Inside the bag, a notepad, a mechanical pencil worn smooth from use, and a folded drawing his daughter had pressed into his hands at the door that morning. A stick figure with wild hair holding a mop in one hand and a lightning bolt in the other. Underneath in careful crayon, "My dad fixes things." He hadn't been able to say no to that. So into the bag it went. And so did the lucky stone Nora kept in her pocket, the smooth gray one she'd found at the park, which she'd solemnly transferred to his palm like she was knighting him. "For courage," she'd said, 6 years old, dead serious. He'd almost cried, right there on the sidewalk. She was down the hall now, in the little family room, happily wrecking a box of building blocks under the eye of a kind woman from the office who'd promised there'd be juice. Now he stood at the glass, watching the room fill up with suits, watching people who moved like they owned the air they breathed. And he felt it, the old familiar feeling, the one that whispered, "You don't belong here. You never did go back to your mop before someone notices." Then a voice at his elbow said, "You're the one." He turned. A woman stood there carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, gray hair, pinned back a lanyard, swinging against a cardigan that had been washed 1,000 times. Not a question the way she'd said it. A statement. The one what? Elias managed. The one who fixed the board. She said it plainly, the way you'd say the sun came up. Whole buildings talking about it. Night shift solved in 20 minutes, what the geniuses couldn't crack in 3 days. She snorted softly. "Course they are." He didn't know what to say. "I didn't really." "Margaret Holloway," she said. "Peg, I run the custodial floor. which means technically I'm your boss. A dry smile. Or I was. Until yesterday, apparently. 64 years old Peg Holloway. 22 years cleaning this building floor by floor, night after night. She'd mopped these halls when half the executives upstairs were still in high school. She'd seen the company change hands twice, seen the logos change, seen the smart young people come in bright-eyed and leave hollow. And she'd seen men like Elias before. That was the thing. "You look like you're about to be sick," she said. "I might be." "Don't." She pushed one of the coffees into his hand. "My husband was a mechanic. Best hands I ever saw. Could listen to an engine and tell you what was wrong before he lifted the hood." Her eyes went somewhere far away, and then came back sharp. "Never once got the credit. Wrong kind of hands. So let me tell you the one thing nobody ever told him." She leaned in, and her voice went quiet and fierce all at once. "You go in there, you sit down, and you don't apologize for taking up space. You hear me?" Elias stared at her. Because in a handful of words, this woman he'd never met had reached into his chest and grabbed hold of something. Something he'd been carrying alone for a very long time. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good." She patted his arm. "Now drink the coffee. You look like you slept in a laundromat." He had, actually, but he didn't say that. Inside the room shifted the moment Adrienne Marchetti entered. People straightened. Voices dropped. The temperature seemed to fall 2 degrees, like the room itself knew to behave. She scanned the table, found Elias, where he'd tucked himself into the corner seat, and pointed to a chair near the middle. "That's yours," she said. He didn't ask. He just moved. "Let's begin." Her voice snapped the room into focus. "Yesterday we nearly lost a multi-phase contract. The predictive engine was drifting, and none of us caught why." She tapped her tablet. "Last night someone did." The screen lit up, and there it was. Elias's own red marker scrawl, his crooked handwriting, projected 12 feet wide in front of the most expensive minds in the building. A murmur moved through the room. Eyes flicked to Elias, then away. "This adjustment reduced our training error by 60%, Adrienne said. "It cut latency, and it made something painfully clear to me." She paused, let it land. "Expertise doesn't always look the way we expect it to." Silence. Then a hand went up. Dorian Pike. Senior Systems Engineer, Stanford MBA, and he made sure you knew it. The kind of man who smiled with his teeth and never his eyes. "With all due respect," he began, "which is what people say right before they show you no respect at all. How do we know this isn't just luck? One lucky guess doesn't make someone qualified to touch production code." "Run it," Adrienne said. "Across all the data sets, right now." Dorian's jaw tightened, but he keyed in the parameters, and the room watched the simulation crawl across the screen clean and smooth, no overfitting the predictions, holding steady across set after set after set. The bar glowed green. "Could still be a coincidence," Dorian muttered. "Maybe." Everyone turned, because it was Elias who'd said it. First words he'd spoken in that room. Calm, steady, his daughter's lucky stone warm in his fist under the table. "Maybe it's luck," he said. "But if it is, I hope we're smart enough to learn from luck when it walks in carrying a mop." A beat. Then somebody laughed. A real one, quick and surprised. And then another. And Dorian Pike's smile went very thin at the edges. Adrienne didn't laugh. But she nodded. Just barely. The way a judge nods when the argument is better than expected. The meeting ran 90 minutes. And Elias didn't say much. But when he did, heads turned. Because he didn't talk like them. He didn't hide behind acronyms and buzzwords. He built pictures instead. "Think of your model like a kid learning to ride a bike," he said at one point. "You keep grabbing the handlebars every time it wobbles. But the wobble is how it learns. You've got to let go a little, or it never finds its own balance." Somebody wrote that down. Somebody else murmured, "Huh." Dorian tried not to look like he was chewing glass. "So we're building our roadmap on bedtime stories now. You ever raise a kid, Dorian?" "No." "Then maybe don't knock bedtime." Elias said it gently, without malice. "That's where the real learning happens. Every night, in the dark, when nobody's watching." That got more nods than he expected, and more than Dorian could stand. Afterward, Elias stepped into the hallway and let out a long breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour and a half. Adrienne followed him out. 2 coffees again, though where she kept finding them he had no idea. "Didn't take you for a performer," she said, handing him one. "I'm not." He accepted it. "I've just been underestimated long enough to get good at playing along." She almost smiled. Almost. "That thing about bedtime," she said. "Where'd it come from?" "It's not a line." He looked at the cup in his hands. "It's just my life. I talk to Nora like she's 6, because she is. So I learned to explain the whole world in things a 6-year-old can hold. Plumbing, baking, bikes." He shrugged. "Turns out grown-ups need it explained that way too. They just won't admit it." They walked together toward the elevators, and for a while neither of them spoke, and it wasn't the sharp kind of silence anymore. It was the kind you leave open on purpose. "Why didn't you go back?" she asked finally. "To engineering? You clearly could have." "To what reapply widowed single dad night shift packs a lunchbox before dawn?" He shook his head. "MIT doesn't hand out do-overs for guys like me." "You could have found a way." "Maybe." He stopped walking. "But I didn't want to rebuild my life. I wanted to build hers first." Adrienne stopped too, and she looked at him. Really looked the way she had that first night. Because she'd sat across from titans of industry who got nervous before she spoke. She'd flown to 5 countries to close deals that moved markets, and none of it had ever knocked her off balance the way this quiet man in a stained shirt just had saying something so plain it should have been obvious. "I wanted to build hers first." "You talk like someone who doesn't know how rare that is," she said, "or like someone too tired to notice." The elevator dinged. Neither of them moved toward it. That afternoon, Elias went back to his shift. Same uniform, same mop, same cart with the squeaky wheel he kept meaning to fix. But something in the building had shifted. People nodded at him now. Not just the interns. Engineers. One of them, a young woman with tired eyes, actually said, "Nice work," as she passed. And she meant it. And when he stopped by the break room, Peg was waiting, arms crossed, a knowing look on her face. "Heard you held your own," she said. "Word travels fast." Word always travels fast about the janitor who embarrassed the MBAs. She grinned. "You should have seen your face this morning, though. Like a man walking to the gallows. Felt like it." And now, Elias thought about it. About the green bar. About the laugh in the room. About the way Adrienne had looked at him by the elevator. "Now I don't know what I'm walking toward," he said. "Which is scarier, honestly." Peg's smile faded into something softer. She sat down across from him, and for a moment she just studied his face. 22 years I've cleaned this building," she said. "You know how many people I've watched come through those doors thinking they were going to change the world. Hundreds. And you know how many actually got the chance." She held up her hand. made a small circle with her fingers. 0. Not because they weren't smart enough, because nobody looked at them twice. Wrong school, wrong accent, wrong zip code, wrong last name. Her voice roughened. This place is full of ghosts, Elias. Brilliant people who got buried because they didn't fit the picture. And I'm tired of watching it happen. So don't you dare be another one. Elias didn't answer right away, because she'd said out loud the thing he'd spent years trying not to think about. The version of himself that had almost given up. The nights he'd lain awake wondering if the smart part of him had died in that hospital along with his wife. "Why do you care so much?" he asked quietly. Peg looked at him for a long moment, and whatever was behind her eyes, she decided not to say all of it. "Because somebody should have cared about a man I loved," she said, standing, gathering her cup, straightening her cardigan. "And nobody did. So somebody's going to get seen this time, even if I have to make it happen myself." And she walked out, and Elias sat alone in the break room with a lump in his throat, the size of a fist. Meanwhile, 6 floors up, something else was moving in the dark. Dorian Pike sat in his office with the door closed and the blinds down, phone pressed to his ear. Voice low and careful. "I'm telling you it's ready," he was saying. "The whole predictive architecture. It's the most valuable thing this company's built in a decade, and I'm the one who understands it end to end." A pause. "Yes. I can have it packaged before I give notice. They'll never know it walked out the door with me." Because Dorian had been talking to a competitor for weeks. Quietly, carefully, building his exit, and the algorithm, that beautiful, valuable, market-moving algorithm, was going to be his parting gift to himself. Except now, there was a problem. A janitor with a red marker improving the very thing Dorian planned to steal. Making it better, making it more famous, drawing eyes to it, making it the last thing on earth Dorian could quietly slip out the door. "No," he said into the phone, watching the city through the blinds. "No, there's a complication. But I'll handle it." A thin smile. "I always handle it." He hung up, sat in the dark, and began very slowly to think of a way to make the janitor disappear. Up in her office, Adrienne stood at the window, with the rain streaking the glass, and she didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that a CTO named Warren Ashcroft had knocked on her door and let himself in the way he'd earned the right to do over 30 years. Early 50s, silver, at the temples, the only person in the building who spoke to her without filtering every word. "That janitor's got people talking," Warren said. "Let them talk." "You think he's got more in him?" "I know he does." Warren crossed his arms and studied her. "You're considering giving him real access, real projects. I'm considering listening more carefully to voices that don't come from boardrooms." She turned from the window. "Is that a problem?" "No." Warren was quiet a moment. Then something crossed his face, an old shadow, a thing he'd carried a long time. "No, it's the opposite of a problem." He looked at the floor. "Adrienne, can I tell you something I've never told anyone here?" She waited. 10 years ago, before you took over, we had a kid. Young, brilliant. Came from nothing, no pedigree, no connections. Saw things nobody else saw." Warren's jaw worked. "And I let them push him out. Told myself he wasn't a culture fit. Wasn't polished enough for the clients." He exhaled. "He went and built something at a competitor that we spent the next 4 years trying to catch up to. And I never forgave myself for it." The rain traced its slow silver lines down the glass. "I've spent a decade wondering what would have happened if I'd just fought for him. Warren said quietly. "So when I see you standing here ready to fight for this one—" His voice caught. "Don't make my mistake. That's all. Don't let him become another ghost in this building." Adrienne said nothing for a long moment. Then she looked back at the window at the city glowing through the rain, and something in her chest, some old locked thing, shifted just slightly on its hinges. "He made the system better," she said finally. "No," Warren said, already turning to leave. "He made you better. That's the part that should scare you." And then he was gone, and she was alone with the rain. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Adrienne Marchetti didn't feel the need to solve anything at all. Not right away. Down in the lobby, at the end of his shift, Elias found one more surprise waiting. A new drawing folded into his cart that Nora must have slipped into his bag that morning without him noticing. This one had two figures, him wild-haired holding his mop, and beside him a tall woman in a black suit. The caption read, "Dad plus Lightning Lady, it's best team." Elias stood there in the empty lobby, holding a child's crayon drawing, and he laughed, softly, to himself, until the laugh turned into something that wasn't quite laughing anymore. Because for the first time in 3 years, he'd let himself hope. And hope he'd learned the hard way was the most dangerous thing a man like him could carry. It happened fast, the way these things always do. Not with a bang, with an email. It landed in Adrienne's inbox at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning, forwarded from the communications team with a subject line that made her stomach drop before she'd finished reading it. And by the time she got to the office, the story was everywhere. Billion-dollar tech firm hands flagship project to Night Janitor. That was the headline. And underneath it, worse. A photo of Elias in his gray uniform, pulled from a building badge, somewhere next to a photo of the Halden Systems logo. The article dripped with that particular kind of mockery that pretends to be concern. Is this a heartwarming story of overlooked genius, or a billion-dollar company so desperate it's letting the cleaning staff write its code? The comments were worse than the article. And by 9 a.m., 3 major investors had called. Not to congratulate. To ask in that smooth, careful voice money always uses whether Halden Systems had a leadership problem. Adrienne stood in her office with the phone still warm in her hand and understood with cold clarity that someone had done this on purpose. Because that badge photo wasn't public. It came from inside, down on the engineering floor. Elias didn't know yet. He was hunched over a workstation running through the autonomous response model, tightening a section of logic that had been bothering him for 2 days. Because that was the thing about Elias. Give him a problem, and he'd forget to eat. He didn't see the glances at first, the way conversation stopped when he walked past, the way people who'd nodded at him yesterday now found somewhere else to look. Until Peg came and stood beside his desk, arms crossed, her face gray. "You seen it," she said quietly. "Seen what?" She slid her phone across the desk, and Elias read the headline, and his stomach turned to ice. "Oh," he said. Just that. "Oh." Because he understood immediately and completely exactly what this was. He'd spent his whole life on the wrong side of stories like this. The janitor, the dropout, the guy who didn't belong. He knew how these things went. He knew who paid for them. And it wasn't going to be him. It was going to be her. "This is going to hurt Adrienne," he said. Not himself. Her. That was where his mind went first, and if you'd known him, that would have told you everything. "The board's going to eat her alive. She stuck her neck out for me, and now—" "Now nothing," Peg said sharply. "You didn't write that article. You didn't leak that photo. Doesn't matter. He was already standing. It never matters. You know that better than anybody. That was when the strategy meeting got called. Emergency. Top floor. And Elias walked into it with the lucky stone in his pocket and a feeling in his chest like the floor was about to give way. The room was full and cold. Dorian Pike was already talking when Elias sat down, which is exactly the reputational risk I flagged from the start. Dorian was saying, smooth as oil. I want to be clear. The math is sound. Nobody's disputing the math. He spread his hands, reasonable, so reasonable. But we're a firm that clients trust with billions of dollars. And right now, the story isn't our technology. The story is that we're so out of ideas, we're pulling code from the cleaning staff. Somebody at the table shifted. Uncomfortable. But nobody argued. I'm not saying it's his fault. Dorian went on, and he even looked at Elias when he said it with those eyes that smiled and never meant it. I'm saying the optics are a disaster, and optics are money. Adrian's voice cut across the room like a blade. The optics are a disaster because someone leaked an internal badge photo to the press. The room went still. Which is a security breach, she said. Which means one of us in this building handed a reporter something they had no legal right to have. Her eyes moved slowly around the table. So before we talk about the janitor's reputation, maybe we should talk about the leakers. Nobody moved. Dorian's expression didn't flicker, not even slightly, which in hindsight should have told her something. Adrienne. One of his board members, an older man named Greer, leaned forward. Nobody's accusing anyone. But the fact remains. We have a client demo in 2 days. The Veradyne contract. $40 million and their whole team is flying in to watch this system run live. He folded his hands. And I'd feel a great deal better if the code we're demonstrating came from our engineering department. Not from a man whose qualifications the internet is currently turning into a punchline. There it was. Elias felt it land in his chest like a stone dropped down a well. The update he wrote is stable, Warren Ashcroft said. Firm. We tested it. It holds. I'm sure it does, Greer said. But we're not just selling a product. We're selling confidence. And right now, his name is a liability. And around the table, slowly, hesitantly, heads began to nod. Adrienne looked at Elias. Do you want to respond? I did. God, he did. He wanted to stand up and tell them exactly how it felt to be measured by his uniform instead of his mind. He wanted to ask them why, if he'd walked in with a Stanford degree and a $1,000 blazer, this would be called innovation. But because he smelled like bleach, it was called a liability. He got as far as opening his mouth, and then he looked around the table. At the nodding heads, at Dorian's carefully neutral face, at Adrienne, who was watching him with something in her eyes that he couldn't stand to name, because it looked too much like the thing he was most afraid of. It looked like her weighing whether he was worth the cost. And that was the thing that broke him. Not the article. Not the board. That look. Because he'd rather leave on his own than stand there and watch her decide. No, he said quietly. No, I don't think I do. He stood. Mr. Greer's right. The story's about me now. Not the work. He picked up his satchel. His hands were steady, which surprised him. So take my name off it. Run the update, don't run it, doesn't matter. The math is the math. It doesn't need me standing next to it. Elias, Adrienne started. It's fine. He wouldn't look at her. Because if he looked at her, he wasn't going to make it out of the room. It's fine. You've got a company to protect. I get it. I've always gotten it. And he walked out. I didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs, all 40 flights, because he needed to move. needed to feel his legs burning, needed something other than the thing crushing his chest. And at the bottom he pushed through the loading dock door into the gray afternoon and stood there in the cold, with his breath fogging in front of him. Peg found him there 20 minutes later. "You idiot," she said, but gently. "Don't." You walked out. I saved her the trouble of firing me. He laughed, and it came out cracked. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Peg came and stood beside him, pulled her cardigan tight against the cold. "Because from where I stood it looked like a brilliant man handing the small people exactly what they wanted, which was for you to disappear." Her voice cracked. "You got the door held open for the first time in your whole life, and you walked back out through it because some man in a suit made you feel small. You let them win without even making them fight. They were always going to win, Peg. Maybe." She wiped at her eyes, quick and angry. "But you're supposed to make them work for it. For all the ones who never got to." And then she went back inside, because it was cold, and because she had a floor to run. And Elias stood alone on the loading dock, and the thing he'd been holding together for 3 years finally came apart in his hands. That night, he didn't go home right away. He drove. Nowhere in particular, just drove the old truck rattling through streets, going dark. Because he couldn't face Nora yet. Couldn't put on the brave face. Couldn't tell her that Daddy had walked into the big fancy room and then walked right back out. When he finally came home, she was asleep on the couch, a half-eaten string cheese beside her, a book open on her chest. And he stood in the doorway and looked at her, and the shame of it nearly buckled his knees. Because he'd told her he was going to show her that her dad was worth being proud of. And instead he'd quit. He carried her to bed, tucked her in, and she stirred half awake and murmured, "Did they like your ideas, Daddy?" "Some of them," he whispered. Which was almost true. "You told the truth." He stopped, his hand on the blanket. "Yeah, baby," he said. "I told the truth." "Then you did good." And she was asleep again before she finished the sentence. Elias sat on the edge of her bed for a long time in the dark. And he didn't feel like he'd done good. He felt like a man who'd been handed the one thing he'd stopped letting himself want and dropped it the second it got heavy. 3 days passed, and Adrienne Marchetti walked past the janitor's closet on the 40th floor without looking twice. The mop bucket wasn't in its usual spot. She barely registered it, because meetings bled into meetings and deadlines barked, and the Veridine team was flying in, and she had a company to run, and a fire to put out, and no time at all, to think about a man in a gray uniform. Except by the 3rd day, something strange had crept into the building. A silence. The kind that settles after a door slams, and nobody comes back. The seat in the corner of the engineering floor stayed empty. His name got quietly removed from the internal channels. No memo, no explanation. Someone else was assigned to the nightly code review, and they did it fine, competently by the book. But nobody caught the things Elias caught. Nobody looked at a line of logic and saw the whole story behind it. And the predictive engine, the beautiful thing he'd made better, started to drift again. Just a little. Just enough. And nobody said his name. Except her. Adrienne stood on the observation deck above the testing lab, watching the floor below glow with monitor light. She should have felt fine. The update was holding mostly. The Veridine demo was on track. On paper, everything was under control. But she kept looking at the corner where he used to stand, hands in his pockets, head tilted, eyes squinting at a screen like he could see the soul of the thing, now just an empty space, and a cleaner sweeping quietly past it, not stopping, not seeing anything at all. Because of course he didn't. He was just there to clean, the way Elias had been, until he wasn't. That evening she stayed late. Everyone had gone home, and she found herself wandering the halls of a building she'd run for 6 years, like a woman walking through someone else's life. She passed the break room. Lights dimmed, chairs stacked, and on a small corkboard by the door, pinned among old flyers and shift schedules, a tiny envelope. Her name on it, in uneven purple crayon. To Miss Marchetti, from Nora Vance. She stared at it for a long moment. Then slowly, like it might dissolve if she moved too fast, she took it down. But before she opened it, a voice behind her said, "She pinned that up 3 days ago." Adrienne turned. Peg Holloway stood in the doorway, a ring of keys in her hand, her cardigan buttoned against the evening chill. "Right before her daddy quit," Peg said. "Nora came in with him some mornings. Sweet little thing. Used to draw pictures for everybody on the floor." She nodded at the envelope. "That one's yours." "How do you—" "I know everything that happens on my floor." Peg's eyes were steady and not entirely kind. 22 years, Miss Marchetti. You'd be amazed what you see when nobody thinks you're worth looking at." Adrienne didn't know what to say to that. So she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, stars drawn in every corner, and in the careful, wobbling handwriting of a child, only a few lines. "Thank you for believing in my dad. He used to smile when he talked about you. He doesn't smile much now, but I still do. Love Nora, age 6. Adrienne read it once, then again. And the woman who had once told a Fortune 500 investor to his face to either get on board or get out of her way. The woman who signed more legal documents than birthday cards, who ate lunch at her desk, and some days forgot the sound of her own voice unless it was giving instructions, sat down on the bench beside the vending machine. She took off her heels, and she cried. Peg didn't say anything. She just came and sat down beside her, this stranger, this woman she barely knew, and let her cry the way you let a person cry, when there's nothing to fix and nothing to say, and the only kindness left is not leaving. "He didn't quit because of the article," Peg said, finally quiet. Adrienne wiped her face. "Then why?" "Because he looked around that table and thought you were deciding whether he was worth keeping." Peg's voice was gentle now. "And that man has spent his whole life being decided about. He wasn't going to sit there and let it happen one more time. So he left first, so it wouldn't hurt as bad." Adrienne pressed the crayon note to her chest. "I wasn't deciding," she whispered. "I was trying to figure out how to protect him." "I know that." Peg patted her knee. "But he didn't, because nobody in his whole life ever protected him before. So how was he supposed to recognize it? And that, more than the article, more than the board, more than any of it, was the thing that broke Adrienne Marchetti's heart clean in two. She sat there a long time. Shoes off, a child's drawing against her chest, a stranger's hand on her knee. And somewhere across the city, in a small apartment with a leaky faucet and a stack of engineering books gathering dust, a brilliant man was tucking his daughter into bed, telling himself he'd done the right thing, and not believing it for a single second. She didn't tell anyone where she was going the next morning. No driver, no calls, just a black coat and a scarf pulled tight and a crayon note folded into her pocket, like a compass pointing somewhere she'd never let herself go, because some part of her already knew that the most important thing in her entire company had just walked out the door 3 days ago, and she was going to have to figure out how to bring him back. The neighborhood hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. Adrienne Marchetti stepped off the bus, and she felt every inch of how out of place she looked. Tailored coat, clean lines, shoes that cost more than the rent on any door she passed. This wasn't the kind of place where appearances were currency. Here people traded in something harder. Quiet survival. She found the building after 20 minutes of walking in circles. The steps creaked. The elevator had a handwritten sign taped over the button. Out of order. Sorry. The hallway smelled of old rain and somebody's cigarettes from a decade ago. Apartment 3B sat at the end of a corridor that echoed every footstep back at her. She stood outside it for a moment, and the woman who closed billion-dollar deals without blinking found that her hand was shaking. Because what was she even going to say? I'm sorry. Sorry didn't fix 3 days of silence. Sorry didn't fix the way she'd let him walk out of that room. She almost turned around, almost got back on the bus and pretended none of this had happened, went back to her glass office and her spreadsheets and her safe, cold, orderly life. Except then she thought of a crayon note against her chest. And she knocked. The click of small feet. A pause. And the door opened. Nora Vance stood there in a glittery unicorn shirt and mismatched socks, her curls held back by a paperclip because they'd run out of the real clips days ago. She looked up at the tall woman in the doorway, and her whole face lit up like a window at dawn. "You're the lightning lady," she said. Adrienne opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "The one who makes Daddy nervous." Nora swung the door wide. "You want to come in? We don't have guest chairs, but we have floor and a beanbag. It's only mildly suspicious." And Adrienne Marchetti, who had a driver and a private office and a corner suite with a view of the whole city, stepped into a 2-room apartment because a 6-year-old told her the beanbag was safe to sit on. Inside, it was small, cluttered in the way of a home where 2 people loved each other and didn't have time for tidiness. Toys on the floor, folded laundry on the counter, a stack of engineering textbooks leaning sideways, a fine layer of dust on the top one. And Adrienne looked at that dust and understood exactly how long it had been since Elias let himself touch that part of his life. "Daddy's out looking for jobs," Nora announced, plopping down onto the rug and pulling out a shoebox of mismatched building blocks. "He says he probably won't find one, but I told him the sun doesn't ask permission to come up." Adrienne lowered herself onto the beanbag, which was in fact surprisingly comfortable. "Did you get that from a cartoon?" "No." Nora looked scandalized. "From Daddy." And that was when Adrienne saw the wall. By the window. A collage of photographs, curling at the edges, taped up with care. Nora and Elias at a park. A science fair, a homemade trophy, both of them grinning. A hospital and a woman in the bed with kind eyes, and Nora's exact curls, holding a much smaller Nora against her chest. "That's Mommy," Nora said, following her gaze. Matter-of-fact the way children are about the enormous things. "She died when I was 3, but Daddy still talks to her sometimes, when he thinks I'm asleep." Adrienne's throat closed. "She looks gentle," she managed. She was. Nora slotted a green block onto a red one. Daddy said she loved 3 things: rainstorms, old poems, and the way he made scrambled eggs. She frowned in concentration. He stopped making eggs after she died, but he started making robots and games and bedtime stories with maps in them. Adrienne blinked hard. "He says," Nora went on, "when your heart breaks, you either let it stay broken or you build something beautiful out of the pieces." She looked up. "He said that right after we set the toaster on fire. It was a very emotional morning." And Adrienne laughed, a real laugh wet, and surprised the kind she hadn't made in years, and it startled both of them. They built for a while in silence. Because Nora, it turned out, only let people she trusted help with the roof of a blockhouse, and after a few minutes, she pushed a small handful of blocks across the rug toward Adrienne, without comment, which was Adrienne, understood a promotion. "Nora," she said carefully, "do you know why your dad left the company?" Nora didn't stop building, but something in her small shoulders changed. "He thought he made people uncomfortable," she said, "that they didn't want a janitor who was smart, that they'd never see the difference between being out of place and being brilliant." The words landed like glass on tile, clear, sharp, impossible to ignore. "He always says." Nora frowned, getting it right. "Sometimes people get scared when the wrong person turns out to be right." Adrienne sat very still on a beanbag in a stranger's living room and felt the whole architecture of her adult life quietly rearrange itself. Because this was a 6-year-old. And she understood something that a room full of MBAs on the 40th floor had missed completely. "You talk like somebody twice your age," Adrienne said softly. "That's 'cause I borrow Daddy's heart sometimes." Nora said it like it was obvious. "He's got a real big one, but it gets tired." Adrienne had to look away for a moment. Out the window, at the gray sky over the gray buildings. Anywhere but at the child who had just said the truest thing anyone had said to her in a decade. When she'd collected herself, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small wrapped box. "Can I give you something?" Nora's eyes went wide. She nodded. Inside was a slim USB drive with a purple ribbon tied around it. "It's a game," Adrienne said. "Your dad helped design the core of it a while back before any of this. It's not public yet. I thought maybe you should be the first person in the whole world to test it." "Does it have dragons?" "Sort of." Adrienne almost smiled. "It has dragons who don't know they're dragons. They think they're pigeons, until they try to fly too far, and they find out they can breathe fire." Nora's mouth formed a perfect O. "That's the best thing I ever heard," she whispered, and clutched the box to her chest like a treasure map. Adrienne stayed longer than she meant to, because there was something about that small, cluttered apartment, something warm and unguarded that she didn't want to leave. And when she finally stood to go, Nora walked her to the door with the gravity of a tiny butler. "Can I leave a message for your dad?" Adrienne asked. Nora pointed to a pad of sticky notes on the counter. "Blue ones are for regular stuff. Pink ones are for important feelings." Adrienne peeled off a pink one, and she stood there for a long moment with the pen in her hand. This woman who drafted contracts in her sleep and found she didn't know how to say the one thing she needed to. In the end, she wrote 5 words. We never got to finish. She underlined it, added her initials, and pressed it to the counter where he'd be sure to see it, at the door. Nora looked up at her with those enormous eyes. "If you make my daddy smile again," she said, "I'll forgive you." Adrienne knelt down so they were eye to eye. "That's a deal," she said, and she meant it more than she'd meant anything in years. Back at Halden Systems, the truth was already starting to surface. Because Warren Ashcroft did not let things go. He'd been bothered since the leak. Bothered by how clean it was. Bothered by that badge photo which nobody outside the building should have been able to access. And Warren had spent 30 years in this company, learning where the bodies were buried, and he knew in his gut that a leak that precise didn't come from carelessness. It came from a plan. So he'd started pulling logs. Quietly. Late at night, when the floor was empty. Access records. Who'd been in the badge database. Who'd touched the internal photo archive in the week before the story broke. and he found a name he didn't expect. Except he did expect it. That was the awful part. Dorian Pike had accessed the badge archive at 11:47, the night before the article ran. But Warren was old enough and careful enough to know that a single log entry wasn't proof. A good lawyer would call it circumstantial. Dorian would say he was auditing security. He'd say anything. He always did. So Warren dug deeper, and that was when he found the second thing. The thing that stopped his blood. Because someone had been in the Veridine demo build. Someone had modified the deployment package right after Elias left. A small change, buried deep. The kind of thing that wouldn't show up until the code was running live in front of a client with $40 million on the table. It was sabotage, set to go off during the demo. And it was tagged in the version history with Elias Vance's old credentials. Warren sat back in his chair in the dark and understood the whole shape of it. Dorian hadn't just wanted Elias gone. He wanted him blamed. He wanted the demo to fail spectacularly publicly, with Elias's name all over the wreckage, so that the story would write itself. The janitor's code crashed the whole thing. Told you so. And then Dorian would ride out the next few weeks, looking like the sensible one. Package up the algorithm and walk out the door to the competitor with his reputation intact. It was clean. It was cruel. And it was almost perfect. Except Dorian had made one mistake. He'd underestimated the invisible people. The old woman who saw everything on her floor. The old CTO who'd spent a decade carrying a guilt that made him incapable of letting another good man get buried. Warren picked up his phone, then set it down, because he needed one more thing. He needed the proof to be airtight, and half of it had already been scrubbed from the system, deleted with an admin key in the hours after he'd started digging, which meant Dorian knew someone was looking, which meant they were running out of time. That evening, Elias came home first. Tired, beaten down from a day of applications and polite rejections, and the slow grinding erosion of a man being told over and over that he wasn't quite the right fit. And he found his daughter asleep on the couch, with a new game glowing on his old laptop, and a Lego dragon perched on her stomach, and on the counter, a pink sticky note. He read it. We never got to finish. And he stood there in his tiny kitchen for a very long time, holding on to the edge of the counter because his knees had gone strange. Nora stirred on the couch. The lightning lady came, she mumbled, half asleep. She's nice. She fixed the roof of my blockhouse. A pause. She has sad eyes like you, Daddy. Does she? Elias whispered. You should call her. And Nora was out again the way only children can be complete and instant. Elias looked at the note, at his sleeping daughter, at the dusty engineering books he hadn't opened in 3 days. And he did not call, because he was afraid. Because calling meant hoping again, and hoping had already cost him more than he could afford. Because a man who'd been decided about his whole life did not know how to walk back through a door once he'd made himself leave it. So he put the note in his pocket, and he carried his daughter to bed, and he lay awake until the gray light came. The next morning, Adrienne was waiting outside Nora's school. Elias saw her before she saw him, standing by the fence in her tailored coat, a folder under her arm, that same unflinching calm in her face. Except it wasn't quite calm this time. There was something underneath it. Something almost like fear. He almost walked the other way. He didn't. You came all this way, he said, stopping a few feet from her. I needed to see you in person. Most CEOs send an email. Most janitors don't solve $100 million problem with a whiteboard marker. A ghost of a smile. Then it was gone. I'm not here as your CEO, Elias. Then what do you want? It came out harder than he meant, because he was protecting something. You want me to come mop up the next crisis, fix the next mess, and then vanish quietly when the optics get bad. She flinched. She actually flinched, and he'd never seen her do that. No, she said. I want you to present at the Veradine demo tomorrow. Silence. The complete, weighted, laugh-out-loud kind of silence. You want me. He stared at her. The guy the internet's turned into a punchline. The guy your board voted off the project 2 days ago. They didn't vote you off. Her voice tightened. They got scared. There's a difference. And they were wrong, and I let them be wrong. And I've spent 3 days not being able to stop thinking about that. Adrienne, there's something else. She pulled the folder from under her arm. Warren found something. In the logs. Her jaw set. The leak wasn't an accident, Elias. And there's a piece of sabotage buried in the demo build timed to fail tomorrow in front of the client. Tagged with your old credentials. Elias went cold. What? Someone wanted the demo to crash, she said quietly. With your name on the wreckage. So the story would end the way stories about men like you always end. And Elias stood on a cracked sidewalk outside his daughter's school and felt something rise in him that he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not hope. Something harder than hope. Anger. The clean, clarifying kind. Dorian, he said. We think so. We can't prove all of it. He's been deleting things faster than Warren can pull them. She stepped closer. Which is why I need you. Because you're the only person who understands that code well enough to find the sabotage before it goes live. Find it, and we don't just save the demo. We prove you were framed. In front of the whole board. In front of the client. In front of everyone who wrote you off. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Why are you fighting for me? He asked. And it was the same question he'd once wanted to ask her a lifetime ago. But this time, she had an answer. Because you remind me of something I used to believe in, she said, before I traded it for board seats and branding guides. That brilliance doesn't come with a title. Her voice dropped. And because your daughter made me a promise keeper, I told her I'd make you smile again. I don't break promises to 6-year-olds. Elias felt his throat go tight. One condition, he said finally. Name it. No handlers, no teleprompter, no voice in my ear telling me how to sound smarter than I am. He held her gaze. If I walk into that room as myself, or I don't walk in at all. Deal. She didn't hesitate. And one more thing. His voice roughened. Don't disappear again. Not on me. And not on her. She's had enough people leave. The air between them changed. She didn't smile. But something warmer, something unguarded flickered behind her eyes. I wasn't planning to, she said. I don't run anymore, Elias. A breath. I just circle the block a few times before I knock. And despite everything, despite the fear and the anger and the impossible day ahead, Elias Vance almost smiled. They had one night to find a piece of sabotage buried in 100,000 lines of code by a man who'd spent days covering his tracks. So they went back to the building after dark. Elias in his own clothes for once. No uniform, no blazer. Just himself. Warren met them at the door with 2 laptops and a look on his face like a man going into battle for something he should have fought for a decade ago. And Peg was there too, because of course she was with a thermos of coffee and a set of master keys to every server room on every floor. "They think we don't see anything," Peg said, pressing a key card into Elias's hand. 22 years they've walked past me like furniture." Her eyes were fierce. "Let's show them what the furniture noticed." And the four of them, the CEO, the CTO, the janitor, and the woman who ran the custodial floor, walked into the dark building together to fight for a man the whole world had decided didn't matter. The clock on the wall read 9:47 p.m. The demo was at 9 the next morning, and somewhere on the 40th floor, in an office with the blinds drawn, Dorian Pike had no idea the invisible people were coming for him. They worked through the night. 4 people, 2 laptops, a thermos of coffee going cold, and 100,000 lines of code between them and the truth. Elias sat hunched over the screen, the way he used to hunch over that whiteboard, one leg bouncing one earbud in the world narrowed down to the thing in front of him. And Warren fed him access folder after folder, version after version. And Peg kept the coffee coming and kept watch on the hallway, because a woman who'd cleaned this building for 22 years knew exactly which floorboards creaked and which cameras pointed where. And Adrienne just sat beside Elias and watched him work, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Hour 1, nothing. Hour 2, nothing. Because Doria was good. He'd buried it deep, wrapped it in legitimate-looking code, disguised the sabotage as an optimization. To anyone reading fast, it looked like housekeeping. Efficient, clean. Except Elias didn't read fast. Elias read the way you'd read a letter from someone you loved, slowly, twice. And somewhere past 3 in the morning, he stopped. "There," he whispered. Adrienne leaned in. "Where?" "Here." He pointed at a block of code that looked to her exactly like all the other code. "It's a conditional, hidden inside the response handler. See how it's set to trigger only under live load, only when the system's running against a real client data set at scale." His voice was quiet, almost reverent, the way a doctor speaks when they've finally found the thing they've been looking for. "It'd never show up in testing. It only wakes up when it matters, during the demo, in front of Veridine. What does it do? Cascading failure." Elias sat back. "It corrupts the prediction loop slowly so it looks like the model is just breaking, drifting, like it was never stable to begin with." He looked up at her, like the janitor's code was garbage all along. The room was very quiet. "He wanted it to look like my fault," Elias said. "It's tagged with your credentials," Warren said grimly. "Your old login. He used it to plant this 3 days ago after you'd already left the building, which is the part that hangs him. Because you weren't here. The badge logs prove you were across town at the school with Nora when this code was committed." He held up a printout. "A man can't be in 2 places at once, and this proves you were never here to write it." Elias stared at the paper, at the timestamp, at the small, boring, bureaucratic detail that happened to be the thing that would clear his name. Because he'd been picking his daughter up from school. Because he'd been buying her a string cheese and listening to her tell him about a spelling test. That was his alibi. That ordinary, tender, invisible fatherhood. That was the thing that would save him. "So we have him," Adrienne said. "We have enough to clear Elias." Warren's jaw tightened. "Whether we can prove Dorian planted it, that's harder. He deleted the direct trail. But," he looked at Elias, If Elias fixes the sabotage before the demo, the system runs clean. Perfect. And then we present the evidence. The tag, the timestamp. The fact that this code was committed by someone using stolen credentials while the real Elias was 3 miles away. He almost smiled. Let Dorian explain that in front of the whole board. Peg from the doorway said, and if he wants the direct proof. She held up a small ring of keys and a knowing look. Server room on 38. The backup logs. He deleted the ones on the main system. But the automated overnight backups on 38, nobody thinks about those. Nobody but the woman who's been dusting that room for 2 decades. Warren's head came up slowly. The off-site mirror. He wouldn't have had access to purge that. He wouldn't have known it existed, Peg said. It's not on any org chart. It's just an old machine in a cold room that a company forgot about. A dry smile. Amazing what you learn when you're invisible. And Adrian looked at this woman. 64 years old, cardigan buttoned to the throat, holding the keys to the one thing that would nail Dorian Pike to the wall, and understood something she should have understood a long time ago. The people this building walked past were the people who'd been paying attention all along. They got the backup logs at 4:30 in the morning. Elias fixed the sabotage by 6, his fingers moving over the keys with a certainty that made Adrienne's chest ache, because this was what he was. This was what the world had let go to waste this brilliant, tired man cleaning up other people's messes at dawn. And by 7, the system ran clean. Flawless. The prediction loop holding steady across every data set they threw at it. It's ready, Elias said, and rubbed his eyes. You're ready, Adrienne corrected. He looked at her, and for a moment the exhaustion fell away, and there was just the two of them, and a long, strange night behind them, and whatever was coming next. I look like I slept in a laundromat, he said. You always look like that. And he laughed, and she laughed, and Peg from the doorway said, You two are exhausting, and refilled the coffee anyway. The Veridine demo was at 9 in the grand conference hall on the top floor, and by 8:45, the room was full. The client team flown in from 3 time zones, the board in their best suits, the engineering department, journalists because Adrienne had at the last minute invited them, which nobody understood, because who invites the press to watch a demo that could crash? Except Adrienne understood. Adrienne had a plan. Dorian Pike arrived at 8:50, smooth and pressed and smiling, expecting to watch a disaster unfold, with his fingerprints nowhere near it. He took a seat near the front, crossed his legs, and felt for the first time a small, cold flicker of something wrong. Because the janitor was standing at the front of the room, in his own clothes. No uniform. A clean but slightly wrinkled button-down that his daughter had made him promise not to tuck in. You look like a magician, Nora had told him that morning, buttoning it wrong and then right. A really nervous one. She was in the back row now, 6 years old in her Galaxy hoodie legs, swinging from a velvet chair too big for her. And beside her sat Peg Holloway, who had never in 22 years been invited to sit in that room, and who sat now with her back straight and her chin high like she owned the place. Adrienne stepped to the front. Before we begin, she said, and the room fell silent. I want to introduce the person who's going to walk you through what our system can do. Some of you have read about him. Most of what you read was wrong. Her eyes swept the room and landed for one cold second on Dorian. This is Elias Vance, and a couple of weeks ago he was cleaning this building at night. A murmur. Someone whispered the janitor. He solved a problem. Adrian said that 17 of the most credentialed engineers I employ could not. And then some people in this company decided his uniform mattered more than his mind. She let that sit. I was one of them, for about 3 days, and I'm not proud of it. She stepped aside and gestured to Elias. He's earned the room. Go ahead. Elias walked to the front. No slides, no animations, just a man and a microphone and a blank screen behind him. He looked out at all those faces, at the money and the power and the polish, at the journalists with their phones up, at his daughter in the back giving him a small, determined thumbs up. And he took a breath, not to calm himself, the kind you take when there's no turning back. I was supposed to clean this room tonight, he said. The room stilled. A couple weeks ago, that's what I did. I came in after everyone left, and I wiped the smudges off the whiteboards. Smudges made by people trying to solve billion-dollar problems. He paused. Turns out one of those smudges wasn't a mistake. It was a missing piece. He clicked the remote. The blank screen filled with a crude, hand-drawn sketch. His own red marker scrawl, the one from that first night. That's how most people see a man like me, he said. Blank, replaceable, furniture that mops. He let a small smile cross his face. I get it. I've been that man my whole life. He clicked again, and now the screen showed the live system ready to run. So let me show you what the furniture noticed. And he ran the demo. It ran clean. It ran beautiful. Across dataset after dataset, the predictions held steady, precise, the kind of accuracy that made the Veridine team lean forward in their seats and start whispering to each other. Because this wasn't a company in trouble. This was a company with something nobody else had. And Elias didn't hide behind the numbers. He translated them. Think of the model like a child learning to read, he said. You don't hand a kid a dictionary and walk away. You sit with them. You point at the words. You let them get it wrong and a little less wrong, until one day they're reading you a bedtime story instead. He looked around. That's all this is. Patience. Trust. The right correction at the right moment. We just taught it the way you'd teach someone you loved. The room was silent, but it was a different silence now, the kind that leans in. And then Adrienne stepped forward. Before we take questions, she said, there's one more thing this room needs to see. She nodded to Warren. And Warren Ashcroft 50. Something 30 years at this company. A decade of guilt behind his eyes stood up and clicked to the next screen, and there it was. The version history. The sabotaged code. The credentials it was tagged with, within the time stamp. And beside it, projected 12 feet wide for the board, and the client, and the journalists, to see the badge log proving that Elias Vance had been across the city at an elementary school when that code was planted. Someone tried to make this system fail today, Warren said, his voice steady and terrible, in front of all of you. They buried a piece of sabotage in the demo build and tagged it with Mr. Vance's stolen login, so that when it crashed, the story would write itself. The reckless company, the unqualified janitor, told you so. The room had gone very, very still. They deleted the trail, Warren continued, or they thought they did, but they didn't know about a backup server on the 38th floor. An old machine in a cold room that this company forgot it owned. He glanced just briefly at Peg. Somebody remembered, and he clicked one more time, and the offsite log came up. And there, undeniable undeleted, was the record of exactly who had accessed Elias's credentials at 11:47 that night, 3 days ago. Every head in the room turned to Dorian Pike. Dorian sat frozen. His smooth face had gone gray, and for a moment he looked like he might bluff it out, might stand up and spin some story, might do the thing he always did. Except there was nothing to say, because the timestamp was the timestamp, and the log was the log, and a man can't be in two places at once. "You," Dorian started and stopped. His voice cracked. "You don't understand." Then help me understand," Adrienne said quietly. And Dorian Pike, cornered, exposed, watched by the whole room he'd tried to impress his entire career, finally broke. But not into anger, into something smaller, something almost human. "Do you know what it's like?" His voice shook. "To do everything right. The school, the degree, the 100-hour weeks. To build your whole life around being the smartest one in the room." He laughed, and it was an awful sound. "A man walks in with a mop. No degree, no pedigree. And in 20 minutes, he sees the thing you couldn't see in 3 days." He looked at Elias, and there was raw terror in his face. "Do you know what that does to a person? To spend your whole life terrified of being replaceable, and then to watch it happen." The room said nothing. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," Dorian whispered. "I was trying to survive, the way I always have." And Elias, who could have said anything, who had every right to be cruel, walked over and crouched down in front of the man who'd tried to destroy him. "I know exactly what that does to a person," Elias said, gently, "because I've spent my whole life feeling replaceable, too, from the other side of it." He held Dorian's gaze. "The difference is you thought the answer was to make someone else disappear, and I think the answer is to stop making anybody disappear at all." He stood. "You don't have to be scared of me, Dorian. There was always room for both of us. That's the part nobody tells you." A pause. "There's always been room." And it wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something harder and kinder. It was a man refusing to become the thing that had been done to him. Security escorted Dorian out, quietly, without cruelty. And the room watched him go, and nobody cheered because there was nothing to cheer about. Just a frightened man who'd let his fear make his choices. Then somebody stood up. A woman in the front row, Veradine's lead, and she began to clap, slowly, and then another, and then the whole room, the board, the client, the journalists rising to their feet, and the sound of it filled the grand hall and spilled out the windows over the city. Not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, for the courage of a man who'd stayed human in a room built to reward everything but that. In the back row, Nora Vance was clapping so hard her paperclip fell out of her hair, and Peg Holloway wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand and didn't care who saw. Afterward, in the emptying room, Warren found Elias by the window. Effective immediately, Warren said, "The board would like to offer you a position. Lead Innovation Advisor." He extended his hand. "No more mop, unless you miss it." Elias shook it, a little stunned. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything." Warren's grip was firm, his eyes wet. "Just don't stop being what you are. I let one of you slip away 10 years ago. I've carried it every day since." His voice thickened. "Thank you for letting me get it right this time." And then Adrienne was there, and Warren stepped away to give them the room. "You saved the whole year," she said softly. "That wasn't the plan." "Then what was—" "Say something honest." He looked at her. "Hope it lands." It landed. They stood there for a moment. the city glowing behind the glass. Everything different than it had been just a couple of weeks ago, when a woman in a charcoal suit had frozen a room with a look, and a man with a mop had seen something on the whiteboard that nobody else could. "You still owe me one," he said. "Do I? You never told me why you really came back. To the apartment. Why you didn't just let it go." Adrienne was quiet for a long moment. "Because your daughter made me see something I'd stopped believing in," she said. "That kindness can be terrifying when you've spent your whole life armored against it." A breath. "And because I missed your coffee. Even the kind that leaks hope." Elias laughed. "Dangerous stuff. That's what makes it good." Sunday mornings in Elias Vance's apartment became sacred, because things changed over the weeks that followed. Not all at once. The way velar change happens. Quietly. In the small hours. In the ordinary moments nobody photographs. The apartment got a little brighter. The engineering books came down off the shelf and got their dust wiped away, and got opened again at the kitchen table with a 6-year-old asking what all the squiggles meant. Elias started cooking scrambled eggs again. The first morning he did, he had to step out onto the fire escape for a minute, because some griefs never leave you. They just soften into something you can carry. And Adrienne came around. More and more. Until one Sunday she was standing barefoot in his living room in one of his flannel shirts like she'd always belonged there, and neither of them could quite remember when that had started. "She's been in there 30 minutes, Adrienne said, sipping coffee, nodding toward Nora's room. "That's concentration." Elias cracked eggs one-handed into the pan. "Means either something wonderful is happening, or she's feeding goldfish crackers to the toaster again." "Should we be worried?" "A little." Then Nora's voice called out, "Dad, Miss Adrienne, you have to come see this." They found her, perched at Elias's old laptop, eyes glowing. On the screen was the game he'd built for her years ago, the one with the maze and the puzzles, and the little AI dragon named Sparks. But something was different today. A glowing button blinked in the corner. "Update available." "What's this?" Adrienne asked. Nora looked at her dad, and Elias, a little sheepish, said, "Go ahead, baby. Press it." She did. The screen faded. A loading bar. And then an animation began to play, one that wasn't part of the original game. Because Elias had made it. In the small hours of the last few weeks when he couldn't sleep. It opened with a cartoon janitor sweeping a hallway under flickering lights. A paper airplane sailed in and hit him in the back. He turned, and there was a cartoon woman in a business suit holding out a crumpled sketch of code. Adrienne's breath caught. "Is that—" "Keep watching," Elias said quietly. The cartoon janitor took the paper, looked at it, smiled. And the music warmed, and the animation pulled back, and a little cartoon girl came riding in on a dragon, scooped up both figures, and soared over a glowing city skyline, trailing lines of code across the sky like fireworks. They landed on a rooftop under the stars, and the screen faded to black, and a single line of text appeared. Adrienne. If you're reading this, press enter. Her hand hovered over the keyboard. She looked at Elias. He gave a small nod. She pressed enter. And the screen bloomed with photographs. Real ones this time. A grainy security cam, still of Elias, at that first whiteboard. Nora, holding up a world's best dad mug, grinning. Adrienne asleep on Elias's shoulder during a late-night brainstorm when she'd thought no one had noticed. All three of them at this very kitchen table syrup on their noses, laughing at something long forgotten. And then, text again. You gave me back my voice. You saw something in me before I knew how to show it. You didn't try to fix me. You just walked beside me while I found my way back, so I'm asking in the only language I know how to speak. Will you stay? Will you be part of this? Will you be family? And Elias stepped up behind her, quiet, steady. In his hand, a small open box. A simple gold ring. No diamond. Nothing flashy. It's not perfect, he said, his voice rough. But neither are we, and I think that's what makes it real. Adrienne turned, and this woman who had stood on stages in front of titans and never once lost her composure, found that her eyes were full and her hands were shaking, and she couldn't say a single word. From the corner, Nora crossed her arms, raised one eyebrow, and declared with the weary authority of a much older person, "Say yes, please. He can't cook alone." And the room broke all of them at once into laughter and tears tangled together, the messy, beautiful kind that you can't tell apart. Adrienne took the ring, slid it onto her finger. A perfect fit. "Yes," she said, her voice thick. "Elias Vance, yes, 1,000 times over." And Nora threw her arms around both of them, and the eggs burned on the stove, and nobody cared even a little. Later, Peg Holloway got a promotion of her own, because Adrienne had watched a 64-year-old woman with a ring of keys do what a whole floor of executives couldn't. So she created a role that hadn't existed before. Head of Talent Discovery, which was a fancy way of saying the person whose whole job was to find the overlooked ones. The ghosts. The brilliant people buried under the wrong zip code and the wrong last name and the wrong uniform. "You want me to find the next Elias," Peg said, when Adrienne offered it. "I want you to find all of them," Adrienne said. "Everyone this building ever walked past. And I want you to make sure it never happens again." And Peg, who had spent 22 years being invisible, who had loved a brilliant man the world never bothered to see, sat down in a real office with her name on the door and cried for a good long while, and then got to work. Because somewhere out there was another mechanic with brilliant hands, another dropout with a dream gone quiet. Another person the world had decided didn't matter. And this time, somebody was looking. That evening, the three of them sat on the fire escape, watching the sun melt down behind the buildings. Elias held Adrienne's hand in one of his, and Nora curled against his other side, half asleep, a Lego dragon rising and falling on her chest with her breathing. "What do we tell people?" Adrienne asked, "when they ask how this happened?" "The truth," Elias said, "that a janitor fell in love with a CEO, that a man who almost gave up found a woman brave enough to knock on his door." He smiled. "And that a little girl with a toy dragon made the whole thing happen." "Exactly that," Nora mumbled, eyes closed. Adrienne leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's not a story," she whispered. "That's a miracle." He kissed the top of her head. "Funny," he said, "how the smallest things change everything. A spilled soda can, a whiteboard nobody erased." He looked down at his daughter. "A crayon note on a corkboard." Because that was the thing he'd learned the hard way over a lifetime of being looked past. That the world is full of quiet genius. In the man with the mop. In the woman with the keys. In the tired ones and the overlooked ones and the ones who fix everybody else's problems and never ask for anything back. And every so often, if you're paying attention, if you're brave enough to really look, one of them turns out to be the missing piece. He'd spent years cleaning up messes other people made. But this quiet, imperfect, beautiful life on a fire escape at sunset. 3 flawed hearts choosing each other. This was the first thing he'd ever built for himself. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue, just home. And as the stars came on, one by one, over the city, Elias Vance looked out at a horizon that had once felt so far away and found that it was just the edge of a beginning. The mop was still in the closet at Halden Systems. He'd asked them to leave it there, because a man should never forget where he started, or who was watching the night everything changed.